Hello and welcome to this episode of the Superhero Ethics Podcast. Friends, you've heard us talk before about the first Godzilla movie and how it started out, and how it. Let's start that again. Friends, we've done a couple episodes on the Godzilla movies, more properly known as the Gojira movies, the Japanese word that is in Americanized Godzilla. And these, as we've talked about, while there's a lot of them that are just fun movies about guys in rubber suits stomping on toy buildings, there's often been, especially from the beginning, quite a lot of social commentary in these movies, and often on the idea of nuclear war and nuclear weapons and things like that, but also branching out in some other things. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about why it is that this particular movie character and this style of movies that is so often associated as I think a lot of people just see it as kind of like, oh, monster movie, often actually has quite deep social meaning, and focus it on the movie Shin Godzilla, movie that came out 2018, and as we'll talk about, is very much a metaphor for and a pretty marked and a pretty pointed commentary on the Fukushima nuclear accident that happened earlier in that decade. So, Riki, let me just first start by introducing you and saying hello and welcome. I'm so glad you're here. And tell us a little bit about what was your kind of entry point into the Gojira movies? Did you first see them as these interesting kind of social commentary movies? Were you a kid who got to watch the fun lizard monster destroy buildings? What was your entry?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in the 80s and 90s when there are roughly four eras of Godzilla movies as it's divided up for the original Toho Japanese studio movies.
Hmm.
I think there's like 34, 35 movies total. And they're divided up into the kind of the imperial, the emperor eras, which is how Japan marks time. Um, and I grew up in the Heisei era,
Hmm.
and the movies of that era really captured my imagination as for a kid, like just fun movies,
Right.
right? And then it wasn't until recently that I really started to pay attention and go, oh, there's something else going on here. And of
Yeah.
course, like I understood the whole message of the original
Right.
of being anti-nuclear, like that is baked into the franchise. But it it wasn't until this movie Shin Gojira that I completely just had this like awakening of like, oh my gosh, like
Yeah.
they've been doing this all along, and this is like the most stark example. And we got like if you have US Netflix, I highly encourage you to go watch Godzilla Minus One, which was released earlier this month
Yep.
on US Netflix. We've sung the praises here, and that's the second movie in what is called the Reiwa era, the current era of Godzilla movies. And in my opinion, it continues that tradition, right, of kind of social awareness, commentary, historical commentary in this case. And we talked about it, and we may like jump back and forth because I think we want to take these two most recent movies as a couple,
Definitely.
especially as we are because of the global success of Minus One. I think
Hmm.
we are going to continue on this path because
Right.
the eras like have had different filmmakers and different visions for each movie, but they often that they are, can be roughly categorized in this way. And I think like the studio seems to be going in this direction where it's like, oh well, we if we've had success with this, and Shin Godzilla, even though it's less known in outside of Japan, it did very well in Japan. I think it might have broken the box office record there, which
Yep.
was
It did.
probably rebroken. Um, and it won the Japanese Academy Award, I believe, that year,
Hmm.
and it was very highly acclaimed
Yeah.
critically and by audiences.
Yeah. It is a very good movie, and I found it really helpful the way you break it down because you said it's not that it's all necessarily the same filmmaker, but it's kind of like how, there are different filmmakers who all make Marvel movies, but the Marvel studio is still trying to have an overall idea. And to be clear on that, because we're talking about the Gojira movies that come from this Japanese studio, the American movies that include Gojira, Godzilla as a character, everything from the Matthew Broderick to the more recent ones with Godzilla and King Kong, those are outside of what we're talking about today. And
Yeah, and no disrespect to those films. I think they're like, in my opinion, they're okay movies, like good popcorn flicks, but I don't think they come anywhere close to approaching like the awareness
yeah,
of like what the franchise can do. Your sound just cut out for me. Hello? I can't hear you. Hello, hello. I can't hear you. Nope. Nothing. Nothing. Okay. Just wanted to unpause something and see if my sound was working. Not on my end. Technical difficulties.
All right, trying again. Can you hear me now?
Oh yeah, hello.
Okay, let's make sure it's working. Does it sound like it's working on the right camera?
Keep talking.
Here we go. Here we go. Talking, 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 talking,
Yeah, I
talking.
think so.
Okay. All right. Editing this will be fun. I think because actually I signed out for a bit, it's going to be a little bit off. So let's just do a clap. 3, 2, 1. All right. So get back. So I'm by no means an expert in Japanese cinema. So I'm by no means an expert in Japanese cinema, but part of my understanding is from some of the research I've done is that in Japan, like in the United States in the 1950s, horror movies or movies that were seen as kind of like, monster movies or strange movies like that were not really being paid attention to by a lot of people, especially the censors. And so, for example, in the 1950s in America under McCarthyism, you actually had an awful lot of, commentary on things happening in America in movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers because the McCarthyites weren't paying attention to it. And in the same way, the first Gojira movie is made only a year or so after the American occupation ends. But while there's still quite a lot of American influence and a lot of American censorship happening in Japan, and so again, it being sort of put into a monster movie allows a lot of this commentary to go a little bit more under the radar. And so at least that's my understanding. But Riki's now making face.
I no, I would disagree with that
Hmm.
to the point because um the US release of that movie, Godzilla, like and when we talk about this character in these movies, like I use the words interchangeably, Gojira, Godzilla, just because that's how I am. But very specifically for that first movie, you have to make it clear whether you're talking about Gojira, the Japanese movie, or Godzilla, the
Right.
US movie, because the US movie is a completely different movie
Hmm.
featuring the actor Raymond Burr, like in a bunch of additional scenes. And I'm pretty sure they removed some commentary about the United States. So, yeah, like I would say that I don't know like how you want to categorize the US as pause.
All right. Sorry. Now my audio went dead. Uh, you were saying that you have to understand that they're two different movies.
Yeah, Godzilla and Gojira, the original 1954 movie, it's completely different. Like it's a different movie, basically like Justice League versus Snyder Cut type thing.
Right.
Because the US release has a completely different storyline involving a journalist played by Raymond Burr, who is not in the original movie. Like they just added this character for a US perspective. And I think they remove a lot of the commentary slash criticism towards the United States for the nuclear. Like I think they don't even say that the nuclear test was done by the United States that
That's right. Yeah,
creates
they
the
take that out
original
entirely.
monster.
They kind of throw France under the bus a little bit, if I remember correctly. No, and that's a fair point. That's a fair point. And like I said, I think it's probably a very much more complex situation than I'm putting it. Um, either way, though, let's kind of start talking about the movie we were going to mostly be focusing on today, Shin Godzilla. Let's talk about the movie we're going to be focusing on today, Shin Godzilla. First, I know that the word shin is significant and has a couple of different meanings that are important. What is your understanding of what the word shin means in Japanese?
Just new, or like you might use it as Neo.
Uh huh.
So like if I were going to translate it to not use Japanese words, I would probably have called it like Neo Godzilla.
Right.
But I like the word Shin.
Oh, I just want to look up one thing. I thought I had this in my notes.
So yeah, I mean it's a Godzilla for a new era, and it's a completely different movie, right?
Right.
From pretty much any other one. Uh,
Well, a
in
little bit
the
of my poking around said that yeah, it often means can mean new. It can also mean kind of like one translator I was reading said that it God isn't quite the right word because it's not necessarily a god in the Western sense, but more sort of as Gojira as a like primordial force of nature of the universe, of something that is just undefeatable, that is just it just is here the way cancer or rain or something like that.
I mean, the word Shin, the character, it does mean God,
Yeah.
and again, like God in Japanese is not the old bearded man in the sky. So
Right.
like it Shin, like if you know Dragon Ball, which I know Matthew doesn't, but in the audience, there was a character in that manga who was called Kami, and when he takes on a disguise, he calls himself Shen, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of another pronunciation of that. So could it be interpreted as God? Maybe. I guess I'd never seen it that way,
Mm-hmm.
in my understanding of it.
Yeah.
But there's the element that the kaiju has always been portrayed as a force of nature, and I think
Right.
nature and gods or spirits are more closely aligned in Japanese mythology than I think in
Mm.
like a Western religion.
Right.
It's more. It would be more similar to the way Roman/Greek gods
Right.
all each one like had an element.
Right. I can see that. And so let's talk about this movie itself, because, and we'll get into some of the specific details, but my understanding is, I'm going to say that again, because this movie I think is very clear, and this is something, if you do any kind of research in this movie, it's becomes quite apparent, is very much a metaphor of what happened with the Fukushima nuclear accident. And for Americans, we probably have a very vague memory and understanding of this, that there was a earthquake off the coast of Japan, that earthquake led to a huge tsunami, which is a like just a huge wave that came and struck the area that included the nuclear power plant, and that led to a nuclear accident that caused quite a lot of devastation. Tell us a little bit about what actually experienced that. Tell us a little bit more about what actually happened then, and what was the real life situation that this movie is clearly kind of making some commentary on.
Well, I mean, first off, the movie there's a scene in the movie where the monster is moving has come ashore and is moving through neighborhoods and brings a wave with it. And so like
Mm.
a wave of water washes through like a river and onto the streets and
Yep.
just like overturning cars, maybe knocks over some buildings, and that imagery is absolutely just like straight from 2011. Like I've watched a lot of footage of the tidal wave, and that the thing is like tidal waves in real life, tsunamis in real life aren't like they are in movies. It's not like a actual like 50-foot tall wave comes and like crashes on the shore. It's more that the water just keeps rising, right? Like
Right.
beyond the normal tidal levels and washes ashore through, back flows through rivers and stuff. And that's the destruction, is just like too much water coming back up through a river and, carrying a bunch of debris with it, and all the streets around the river become flooded. So like that was like a very direct image to me. Like when I saw that, I was like, oh, I didn't even like fully understand, but I was like, oh, like I've seen this before, like in
Mm-hmm.
real life.
Yeah.
And then in terms of what happened, I mean the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear reactor. Um, I, I don't know the technical aspects of it, but
Uh-huh.
basically there was a meltdown.
Right.
Um, and the main thing that this movie is drawing attention to and criticizing is the government response,
Mm-hmm.
because there has been a lot of investigative reporting about what the government was doing, and it was basically nothing slash um, possibly like backpedaling and hiding stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which a lot of times that happens with governments. I think the
Yeah.
pandemic response in many nations kind of mirrors this of like downplaying the seriousness of it, and then when it's discovered how serious it is, kind of like backpedaling and like, oh, we always took it seriously. Meanwhile, that's not what the records show.
Right.
And there's, to me, like there's a couple of things. The prime minister in the movie, I think, after a certain point, is often seen in like a blue, like a one piece,
Yeah,
not
like
a
a worker
suit.
uniform.
Yeah, and that very much mirrors the prime minister of Japan at the time, Naoto Kan. I
Hmm.
think intentionally like try to portray himself as like, I'm on the ground dealing with this, like
Right.
in the blue suit.
Yeah,
Um, and,
there's a great scene of that where, and it was moments like this that some commentators I read on this made the similar point that in some way it's not even this is commentary, that this almost goes into parody or satire of the
oh
government,
yeah, yeah. I think
because the prime
it's
minister literally like ends the one of these big meetings and saying, "I have to go speak to the press, so I have to go change into my uniform,"
yeah.
and it's just so pointed of like this is clearly not someone who put on the uniform and then appeared before the press. He just puts it on to speak to the
And
press.
there's a press conference in the movie. There's a press conference the minister gives where he says something like, "Don't worry, the monster is not gonna make landfall. It's not gonna come ashore." And then like someone walks out on the stage and like whispers in his ear or something. He's like, "Oh, I've just been told that the monster has come
Yeah.
ashore."
And
And
it's
like
really
we
not.
laugh about it, but when it's a real disaster in its real lives, like that's the frustration
Yeah.
that a lot of people felt, especially like those in the area, because there are. I read some reporting about basically the evacuation orders that were given. It was a very small radius around the nuclear reactor, and
Mhm.
other like international safety agencies were advising, radiuses 10 times that. So like literally they were not telling people, giving people information to save their lives in some cases.
Yeah, and the movie does a really good job of skewering that. One of the things that happens, especially in the first half of the movie, is that there's just endless committee meetings and bureaucracy. And it
Right.
really does this wonderful job of showing that instead of people saying, okay, well, here's the evacuation, it's we need to have a committee that will establish the committee that will discuss the evacuation. And then if we
Yeah.
want an evaluation, we need another committee to decide how much it's going to be. But then another committee has to set up that first committee. And it just goes, there's so much red tape and bureaucracy to the point where they're always like 5 steps behind what's actually happening.
And that's one of the things that I was saying. This is completely different from any other movie. It is filmed almost like a documentary or like a
Yeah.
mockumentary, right? Like a lot of it is just guys in meetings with the subtitles. And I'm sure for you, you just like didn't even, because you already have to read the subtitles for the dialogue,
Uh-huh.
right? And it's like the meeting does this to establish the blah 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 blah. Like
Oh,
I didn't read them either. Like I can read Japanese, but I was like, I don't care. Like at that point, yeah, it is just satire of
yeah. I mean,
just,
it felt to me like Parks
here's
and Rec.
way too many words for you
Yeah.
to emphasize how kind of useless this meeting is.
Hmm. Yeah, very much so. I mean, I definitely was following along with all the words, and yeah, it took me a few minutes to realize, no, this isn't like trying to make me feel like I'm supposed to be laughing at this whole thing.
Yeah, like it's not meant as information on the screen.
Right. And in that way, it was a very. Like I mentioned Parks and Rec. It felt more like it's obviously dealing with a much more serious issue, in terms of what's happening in the world, but it is that very, yeah, that mockumentary over the topness, that moment of the prime minister saying it's not going to appear on land, and then immediately, I mean, Mary and I both broke out laughing. It was a hilarious, the comedic timing of it was brilliant, and
Right.
you did something like that, it felt I don't think I've ever laughed like that, except maybe when, Godzilla passively aggressively like grunts at the military when he's in the big rubber suit in some of the sillier movies. I've never had that kind of a laugh out loud moment
Right,
in
but
a
it's
Godzilla movie.
completely different because in that you're laughing at the unreality of that, of
Yeah.
the rubber suit monster acting like a human. Here we are laughing at the reality of it. It's like too real. And you're like, oh my gosh,
Right.
like what are they doing? And but that's the point, is that this movie is just like directly pointing a finger at the government.
Right.
And we get other scenes of like the when the Japanese Defense Force, the military, finally deploys and is asking for permission to engage over civilian territory, right, in a city. And I think they make someone tries to make a point like we haven't fully evacuated the area yet, and the military is pushing for action. And I think that they are ultimately given permission. I don't know. I don't know how to take that. I'm curious how you take kind of the use of military, because I mean, you and I have talked about it, but I don't think you
Uh-huh.
have the perspective of, Japan
Yeah,
as
I mean,
the pacifist nation, and like the use of military has to be limited.
yeah, I mean, I have a very different perspective on it. Let me state my context, and then I'll say how I understood what was happening in the movie. I grew up in the '80s, during which a lot of the worst Japanophobia, and sort of specifically Asian directed racism, I think, was really occurring. Some of the worst, I think, since the 1940s and the internment and all that,
Worst
because
until now.
well, yes, also very true. This was the era when companies like Toyota and Honda were really starting to have a real impact in American markets at the same time that Ford and others were not doing well. And there was a real fear of Japanese businesses, crowding everything out. And one thing that you hear often, especially from Republicans, was this a sort of bitterness of, well, of course Japan can, do all these things because we're paying their military bill, because
Yeah.
part of the the treaty to end World War II was this very strict um, limits on what Japan could do in terms of having a defense force, and that the U.S. was in many ways its primary defense, and that we were spending quite a lot of money on having troops there and all this kind of stuff. And at the same time, I think like and my father was someone who was very interested in this because he had studied the war crimes after World War II in Japan and compared those to Nuremberg and talked about how racist the difference was, and that for example, there was like Germany was rearming by 1949. There was by no means and Germany had started two world wars. Japan had been on the Allied side in World War One, and so like I had always should have been very hyper aware of the Japanese military situation being something that's very much a creation of American fears and American racism and things like that. At the same time, though, I think for me, I just have it a reflexive. The military is always going to be bad, and so things that praise the military are going to feel a little weird to me. And certainly something that is trying to be kind of progressive in its social commentary is not going to be very favorable towards the military. I say that because it felt like this movie was actually somewhat favorable towards the military and towards the idea of because there's a lot of stuff in there about, well, should we mobilize the military to deal with this? And it's the prime minister and the governments and the bureaucrats who are kind of like clutching their pearls and saying, no, we can't be the militarized nation again. We have to keep being passive. While the generals are saying like this thing is killing our people by the thousands or tens of thousands or millions or whatever it is. Um, and again, I was actually very curious about that scene because there's at first the military wants to attack while the evacuation isn't finished, but then there's a moment where it is the evacuation is almost entirely finished, and there's literally one old man who hasn't gotten out yet, and they have a chance to take down Gojira while he's in the process of destroying incredible amounts of property and killing probably again huge amounts of people, and they decide not to because this one person might be harmed. And then later in the movie, when finally the military is kind of given the chance to do its thing, this combination of the military and some of the civilians come up with this incredibly ingenious plan to use trains and cranes and all these different things to together take down Gojira. And it felt to me at least that the military comes off quite well. So my sense at least, and again from the perspective that doesn't have the cultural context, and so tell me if I'm very wrong, my sense though was that this movie was somewhat of a hey, you know what, Japan, it's okay if we have a military. It's okay if we maybe actually start to think of ourselves as people who can have a military that can solve problems.
Yeah, I'm conflicted, and it's interesting because when this movie was released, apparently the prime minister, not the one that is being criticized, Shinzo Abe, apparently said something about how the scenes with the Japanese Defense Force looked cool. That's how I've seen it translated. I haven't found the original quote in Japanese. So he seemed very positive on this movie. And then, of course, because it's politics, the opposition party leader had to get a word in and said, "Well, I don't think that the deployment of the defense force was constitutional in this movie."
Right.
But that goes to the point of Japan, how it's supposed to use and deploy its military. Which, ironically, I guess I will say, I just quickly looked up the defense spending is top 10 in the world.
Yeah.
And some of that is probably more recent. I know that there has been a ramp up in spending because of things like North Korean missile tests,
Uh huh.
but I believe Japan has always at least been like top 15, top 20 in the world
Right.
in spending. So it's a weird situation for sure.
Hmm.
Um, the ending of the movie I have interpreted as more a civilian victory. And I said a
Hmm.
similar thing about Godzilla minus one. Um, Even though they do use military hardware in this movie in Shin Godzilla, I don't think they shot any weapons at him, right? To distract him.
What
Th-
they fight they hit him with the trains that are full of explosives,
right. They use the
and then
trains, they use the fire trucks with the hoses,
mhm,
right? But they don't use tanks, they don't use the
well,
helicopters.
because they also I think they do have quite a lot of other weapons firing, because part of what they do is they literally knock buildings down on top of him to kind of like pin him down.
Mhm. But
So
it's I guess I'm like kind of making like a Batman argument,
yeah,
right? Like he won't use guns. Like they're not using military
yes,
weapons.
I think that's true. Yeah, and to be clear, a very important part of the story, because again, I think there's a sort of sense of like, okay, we're going to mostly make this about the nuclear plants, but it's a Gojira movie, so we have to be remembering that the world wants to use nuclear weapons, and that's stupid and wrong. The one of the real sort of like climax points of the movie is that the rest of the world, led by the United States, who does not come off well in this movie, I think deservedly so, has basically said to the Japanese people, "We are very worried that Gojira is going to attack the rest of us. So unless you can stop him, we are going to literally nuke Tokyo and drop a
Yeah.
nuclear bomb with the intent of killing him."
It's hard to write a Japanese nuclear story that isn't anti-American, I will say.
I mean, I think that's fair. I think that's very fair.
Again, that's kind of baked into the DNA of the story.
Hmm.
It's probably a little more pointed than pretty much anything since the original, though, I think.
I think so. I mean, there's even a point where um, it's interesting. There's a character who is supposed to be a Japanese American envoy who works for the U.S. government, who's portrayed very sympathetically and clearly is unhappy with what her government is doing. And interestingly enough, she speaks English with a very heavy accent, and um, but like some of the things that she talks about that the Americans are doing is that like she makes clear that it's not just that the Americans are worried that Gojira is going to do all this damage. They specifically are worried that Russia and China are going to get control of it, which to me felt like a very point. I know that one of the sort of big pushes of the anti-militarization movement in Japan during the Cold War was this fear that Japan had become, a pawn of the United States in the Cold War, and that part of why it was so important for all these American forces to be there was, yeah, during the Korean War, Japan became a real sort of base of operations, and then in all of the you know uh, sort of twilight struggles against both Russia and and China, that Japan was always kind of seen as the point of the American sword. And so I thought that was another very pointed reference of this idea that somehow the Americans are so wrapped up in those mentalities that their concern is that Russia or China will get to control Godzilla, instead of recognizing that no one controls Godzilla.
Yeah, regarding that character, let's see. I'm just looking up the name of the character is Kyoko Ann Patterson. I
Mm,
believe said she's supposed to be half, right?
right.
Like half Japanese, half American.
American.
But what was born in the United States because I believe she makes some comment about like wanting to be president someday.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
I definitely noticed her accent, and that's what I will say about that is welcome to my world. When
mhm,
people speak Japanese
yeah.
in Western movies, it
Yep.
is often very much not Japanese actors who are just given lines to read phonetically
Yeah.
because the 99% of the audience is not going to know the difference.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the case here that the actress they got is not clearly not a native English speaker, but a lot of people in Japan know English like
Right.
as a language that they are taught at school, but did not sound like someone who was born and raised in the U.S. and wants to be president someday for sure.
Yeah. But yeah, it was a little odd. But again, you're right. Like American movies have Japanese characters like that who, represented as the Japanese government or the Chinese government or Korean or whatever, who don't sound at all like that they would. It even goes so far as during the strike, I was watching a lot of BBC productions, and until I think the 90s, the British Broadcasting Company had a specific rule that you could not hire an American actor unless it was absolutely impossible to find an English actor to play the part. So there are a lot of BBC productions of English actors doing hilariously bad American accents, um, which, given how many Americans have done hilariously bad English accents, is feels very karmic. But yeah, and we're now pretty far off the topic here, but a fun diversion with his character. What do you think of her character and the role she played?
Uh, I didn't like her character. I didn't like that whole storyline. I will
Hmm.
say about the United States and the other nations wanting to gain control of the monster or like get the DNA materials or whatever, right? And it was yeah, it felt a little too different from everything else that was going on at that point. And I guess the point of this movie, as often as the case with these movies, is to portray Japanese strength
Right,
as a nation, right? To defeat the monster on our own without outside assistance.
right.
Because the same thing happens in minus one. In
Yeah.
that case, like they have a line of dialogue that's like, well, the U.S. military doesn't want to get involved because of the Soviet Union,
Hmm.
and so we have to deal with this on our own.
And here, once again, the American government, I think it's a very pointed point that they don't want to help. The only time they offer to interfere is when they're like, well, you haven't fixed the problem and we weren't willing to help you fix the problem. So now we're just going to drop a nuclear bomb on Tokyo. And
Yeah,
it's a UN plan, but it's clearly kind of driven by the Americans.
and from a timeline perspective, like inside the movie,
Uh huh.
I think the problem is that it seems kind of rushed,
Mm,
right? To reach that point where like we're gonna drop a nuke when there has been no previous attempt, because there, we talk about like there are U.S. military forces stationed in Japan, and
right.
for there to be no conventional military attempt to take out the monster before like the nuclear option literally is invoked seems like a time skip of sorts, I guess,
Yeah, I can see that.
for plot convenience.
One thing that I also noticed by it not being there, and again, this may well be just because I don't understand the situation. A lot of times if this movie was happening in Great Britain, everyone understands that the king is primarily a figurehead, but still is someone who the government consults with on major decisions and things like that. And that sometimes the movie would portray that, at least in some small way. The Japanese emperor is never mentioned at all during this conversation about what is, basically portrayed as an existential threat to Japan itself. Is it? I'm wondering, is it just that that's, everyone understands that the Japanese emperor is so far removed from decision making that there'd be no point of it including that person in the movie at all? Is it more of a cultural, like, we don't represent the Japanese emperor on screen because of the respect that's held? Did it seem noteworthy at all to you that character never appears, or was it just that
No,
it was
not at all.
or-
I mean, thinking about it now, I would, I mean, without looking it up, I would have to surmise that the emperor has absolutely no political power right now
Mhm. Right,
because of the nature of our history.
right,
Like the monarch in the United Kingdom still has like nominal power. They don't exercise it, right?
right.
Because of what that nation has become. But my understanding is that the monarch could just dismiss the prime minister if they wanted to. Like, would that not be correct?
Yes, that
Yeah.
is my
So it's like they
understanding.
serve at the willingness of the monarch.
Yeah, and also I think significantly here, this is a more ceremonial role, but important one. When there are sort of huge tragedies in the United Kingdom and many other places with a monarch, it's expected that it's the monarch who will give the
Hmm.
"our nation is being challenged, but we will rally together" speech. The government will often write that speech for the monarch. But like, so for example, the Queen gave a speech during when COVID was really bad for Great Britain, and
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Even when the actual historical disaster happened, of course, like I'm not tuned into like Japanese news media as
yeah,
much, but I'm not sure
yeah,
if it would be appropriate or expected for the emperor to make a statement regarding a natural disaster.
right,
What I would follow up with though is that in a fictional world, yeah, I feel like there would be a certain amount of reluctance to portray the emperor
mm,
because in Japanese culture, the emperor is considered a god, right?
right,
Like whether you believe in that theologically or not, like culturally, we refer to the emperor as Tenno, which means literally means God.
right.
Um, so to have, like, I'm just trying to imagine, like, to ask an actor to portray the emperor, like, I don't think anyone would want to do that,
Yeah.
and I don't know that the industry would want to do that in general. So, like, I'm quickly
Whereas
just
there's
trying
been a
to
whole
think, like,
cottage
I don't,
industry of British actors portraying Charles and Diana and
right,
all the
right,
foibles of those folks.
but I can't, I don't think it's just kind of taboo. If
Yeah,
I had to
that
put
makes
my
sense.
finger on it, like right now.
Yeah,
That's a curious question, and one I might do some research after this on the
yeah, I'd be very
portrayal of
curious.
the emperor and like and also like on their role in government. Because like I said, I cannot imagine that even like a whiff of we are governing in the name of the emperor would want to be uttered, given
Mm.
you know what historically that meant. So yes, like the emperor is a figurehead. Um, and probably not an active participant.
Well, it makes a lot of sense since i we're talking about Great Britain, but there's many nations that are constitutional monarchies where it's been a slow reduction of the monarch's power, sometimes
Right.
officially, sometimes unofficially. Whereas in Japan, it was again dictated. The Americans very much wanted the emperor to abdicate entirely, and that was considered one of the real sticking points. Is that you couldn't we that that the Americans finally came to understand that Japan would never make peace unless the emperor could stay the emperor. And so I'd imagine when it's America saying, "Here's the way you get to keep your emperor," that they're going to put much more restrictions on what powers
Right.
the emperor can have and all that kind of thing.
That a the emperor, um, I mean, quite literally got to stay alive, right? Like I'm sure
Right.
they had debates on whether to charge the emperor with war crimes,
Hmm.
etc. Um, and yeah, like that would have been just like a no go for Japan at the time, and even now, like again, I think the way that the emperor is not portrayed in media
Mm-hmm.
probably gives them like a amount of distance and reverence
Right.
that's upholds to this day,
Yeah.
that it hasn't just become this character in media the way that the king and queen or like presidents in US movies, like whether you are having an actor portray a real president or have like
Right.
a fictionalized president, right? That the
Well, yeah. I
office
mean,
of the president has become, I think, kind of diluted in our minds because
yeah.
of the media portrayal.
And that's somewhat recent. I mean, if you look at a show like West Wing, it never made reference to any living U.S. president. It
Hmm.
always referred to like the predecessor and that, and many movies did the same. More recently, West Wing, feel old, everybody is more than 20 years old by now. More recently, stuff will something I think like Scandal would sometimes make reference to Obama or Bush or people like that. So yeah, even that's changing. Back to this, what one thing that I thought was also really interesting, and this kind of goes again to the kind of national pride idea, is that the movie really focuses towards the end, on the ingenuity of the Japanese people to come up with this way to, because what they do is they basically pump a blood coagulant into Gojira to freeze him in place. So that he doesn't have to be killed, so they can do scientific study, but also again to avoid the nuclear bomb. And it's really played in this kind of like, oh, the dumb Americans, they just want to use weapons. We are actually going to be the smart ones and come up with it. And between that and then also at the end, there's this real sense of like you see the characters kind of out amongst the scrap and the rubble, and a real sense of it's okay, we're going to rebuild, and that we can still make everything better again. And again, in my research, one thing I found is that actually a number of Japanese post World War II movies had that same kind of idea of like, look how much we did suffer the nuclear attacks, we did suffer the horrific firebombing of Tokyo in 1945 and all these things, but that Japan was able to rebuild. And that's a point of, to be the economic giant it was by the 80s. And that's a real point of national pride. And again, I thought that was a really interesting way the movie focused on that and kind of a like, we are stronger than the bureaucracy that tried to hold us down.
Yeah, definitely like the what you said about pride. And I think that's an interesting through line in all of these movies is the destruction and the rebuilding.
Right.
I mean, it literally in every Godzilla movie, the monsters come. I think there's one where Godzilla goes to New York City,
Yeah.
but and I'm talking about the Japanese ones. But like Tokyo or like some other city is getting stomped on, right? And
Yeah.
then by the next movie, oftentimes in the real life timeline released in the next year, the city is rebuilt and like gets stomped on again. Like the continuity within the movies is not clear, is like it all the same, even though by the mid Showa era, every time Godzilla shows up, everyone knows, and they're like, "Oh, it's Godzilla! Run!" Like
Yeah.
we've done this before. But yeah, I think it is a fascinating. It's definitely an allegory on rebuilding after World War II, for sure.
Yeah.
But I think here also after the Fukushima disaster of having to rebuild that area,
Right.
the nation, the power structure, all of that. So yeah, and I think that's why it's such a beloved franchise. Like, hey, it's fun,
Mm-hmm.
but there's always that sense of Japanese pride, national pride, um,
Mm-hmm.
and like I said, I for me personally, and I think this movie is showcasing civilian ingenuity and power rather than
Mm-hmm.
military. Like the military fails to stop the
Right.
monster in the first half. The prime minister is killed, like trying to escape in the helicopter, which seemed like very pointed critique.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I thought, again, like drawing parallels to minus one, the military fails in the first half. Like they bring in the heavy cruiser, I believe the Takao, and it just gets destroyed. And it
Yeah.
is the civilians, although do use some military hardware. They don't. Again, they don't fire guns. I guess other than the plane.
Right.
So it's interesting. I've been reading some stuff that suggests that Godzilla minus one is right wing propaganda, that it's fascistic, and I don't see that, and I disagree. But I'm trying to understand and learn, and
Right.
make sure that my appreciation of it is tempered properly, right? Of both of these movies, because
Yeah.
the like I said, the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was very praised the movie and the use of the military in the movie. And I'm like, oh, well, if he likes that, like maybe there's
Yeah.
something wrong because his views on the military are very different from mine.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that was definitely something I noted because again, like I think it's just so important that we recognize things outside of our context. For me, a movie that is critiquing the government, I was saying this before, is almost is going to be deeply critical of, I don't want to say nationalism, but national pride. And rah rah Americanism is kind of the opposite of what generally those movies would be. And so, yeah, having there be a real sense of rah rah Japan, and I think, yeah, it may well be that it has more of those kind of connotations you're talking about, but also the thing is we're talking about, like, that sentiment is very different in a nation that has been so thoroughly, harmed and destroyed and then rebuilt, compared to a nation like the United States, which has just had global hegemonic power in a very different way. It's like, a statement of pride by the bully versus someone who's coming from a different position of power, something like that.
Yeah, and I think there's a big difference. Like if this movie had ended with the Japanese Defense Force defeating Godzilla with military arms, like
Uh
developing
huh.
some new weapon, like to defeat him, I would have a very different feeling about it.
Yeah, I think it's fair.
And while the military may have been involved in the final victory, like they don't fire any guns, like there's no tanks. Um, People are not in dressed in military uniform, right? They were all kind of wearing the white,
Yeah.
the like anti-radiation outfits, I believe, something like that.
Mhm. Yep.
So yeah, I don't know. I am open to other interpretations, and I think that that is important with a movie like this because I like this movie, and then again minus one really make you think about
Mhm.
stuff. Like this movie in particular made me think about not just Japan, but Japanese history, about the history of Godzilla movies. Like,
Right.
and I was just like, I had one of those brain expanding moments after I watched this. It's like, oh my goodness, like what's going on here?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing I was learning in my research was that the eff- the actual events of the Fukushima nuclear meltdown, there was a real push in Japan for a while to get rid of nuclear power entirely, which is
Hmm.
a very complex issue right now because obviously nuclear power has massive dangers, but when it is working properly, as I understand it, by many, like, it is certainly much cleaner in a lot of ways than like coal and oil and things like that and carbon burning, but also has these other major problems, and so that's a very complicated issue. And so, yeah, it was just very interesting the way this movie was, as I understand it, like a lot of people wind up like referencing it during like some of the elections that happened since then, in terms of like, well, because this movie is making this point, this movie is making this point.
Yeah, I mean the prime minister at the time, Naoto Kan himself, went on to be staunchly anti-nuclear,
Right.
anti-nuclear power, and like I haven't dug deeply into the policy positions, but you can't just say I'm anti-nuclear and get rid of them, right? Like it's all degrees. So it's about targets for by like 2030 we want the energy grid to be supported by X% nuclear, X% other things, right? And how you shift those numbers over
Right.
time and what you potentially replace, future nuclear reactors with.
Right.
I think is the point.
For sure. Yeah, because again, like if you're able to replace it with solar or wind, it's one thing. If you're replacing nuclear by going back to coal and oil, that's obviously, climate
Right.
change. Do you
I think it's strongly like a renewable, an effort to change to renewable energy
yeah,
rather than nuclear.
very much so. Well, Riki, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, as always. We're not going to have any bonus content this week just because I have been traveling like crazy. We've not had it a little bit for the last couple weeks, which I apologize for. I am now done with all my travels. I got on my last airplane early this morning, landed back home. I will not be getting on a plane for another couple months. So thank you all to our listeners. We want to know what you think, obviously. Let us know in the feedback and thoughts, email, Facebook, all the things. And Riki Livich, give you a chance to have the last word. Any other last things you want to bring up or questions you want to ask or points you want to make?
Yeah, I mean today we mostly talked about Shin Godzilla, but it's unfortunately not available for streaming. I think anywhere that I could find.
I was able to find it. I think we had to pay. I think it was through.
Yeah, you
We
would have to
Googled
rent it
Shin
separately.
Godzilla. Yeah, I think we had to rent it. It was like $5 to rent it online.
But like I said, Godzilla minus one is available if you already have Netflix
Yep.
US. And I would be very much curious to hear from our listeners how they feel about that movie just in general. Like
Mm-hmm.
I love it.
Yeah.
And especially like given the context of what we have discussed today, what do you think that movie says about, Japan, Japanese military, and do you think that it's a right-wing propaganda piece? As,
Yeah.
as I read some people say, because I thought it was very anti-war. So I'm like, what do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very curious about it because, and we did a full episode about it, but it's funny we didn't get
Hmm.
as much into this topic because I was thinking back on it. Again, when I talk about growing up in the America of the 1980s, which was very anti-Japan, kamikaze was also often talked about as this most like underhanded, like no honor, no, this isn't how war should be fought. It's not like honorable combat. It's this, suicide pilots and stuff like that. And it was real seen as a way of like, denigrating Japan. And it was always very interesting because at the same time, karate was becoming very popular at that same time, which was very much, like an honoring of Japan and Japanese culture and things like that. So, yeah, and because the movie is very much about the vindication of a kamikaze pilot as one of the main characters. And granted, it's about the vindication of his decision not to be a kamikaze, but still is about his military prowess being a big part of how they solve things. So, yeah, I would love to hear some other people's thoughts
It
on it.
Yeah, without going too into it, it's a vindication of that character, but
Mhm.
a rebuke of the policy, right?
Right.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, because it's at the early part of the movie, he is shamed for not having crashed his plane into an American ship, and at a point in the movie, there's a feeling that he could. Well, I don't want to give away the ending, but yeah, I think what you just said is exactly right. That he is personally vindicated, but not because like that it is vindicating the policy of kamikaze attacks.
Yeah.
Well, this has
So
been
I don't know, like any media, I think, can be interpreted or even twisted to
yeah
certain views, and I'm not opposed to having discussions about that, but like let's have honest discussions about it and
yeah.
try to figure out how we feel together. Like I don't know.
Let,
I
let me
want to read more.
And let me actually ask one last question, just to set the context here. And again, this might be something you don't know much about. Um, the day we're recording this is the day after Europe had continent-wide elections for the European Parliament, in
Hmm.
which, in some countries, far-right parties, particularly in France and Germany, were much more successful than people had thought, and there's a decided shift in that direction. As it turns out, the shift is not quite as bad as people feared it could be, but it's definitely a thing that's happening.
Hmm.
Is there a similar kind of rise of the kind of like Trump, Orban, Putin inspired far right parties in Japanese politics at this point?
So I'm laughing because I would say there is not a sharp rise because the far right has always been in power in
Mm,
Japan.
fair.
Actually, the the prime minister who the Fukushima disaster, is critiquing and is blamed on, Naoto Kan was part of the Japanese Democratic Party. I'm looking at the name translation. Democratic Party of Japan,
Okay.
which is considered like a center left party. And his party was in power for probably less than a decade. And of course, like this disaster and the critique at the time just led to him being pushed out of power, and the party was dissolved and merged with another party. Other than that, like small period when he was in power, like 30, 40 years most for the most part, the party of Shinzo Abe, the I think they're called the Liberal Democratic Party.
Uh-huh.
Don't take those words at all to mean what they
Right.
sound like. Like it's a very far right, authoritarian, pro-military party, to the point
Interesting.
where the Shinzo Abe, the prime minister at the time, was trying to revoke Article 9. I think I've mentioned this before. Article 9 of the Constitution, which is the one that says Japan shall not wage war against other nations.
Right.
Um, so like has there been a shift of percentages? Maybe, but like they've been in power in Japan for quite a while.
Interesting. Very interesting.
But it
All right.
means different things, right? Like
Yeah.
these political spectrums mean different things in different countries as to what the specific policies are and how they apply. Because one of the reasons the far right is ascendant in Europe has to do with immigration, right? Like they
Right.
are one of their big policy points is anti-immigration, especially anti-Muslim immigration in Europe.
Mhm.
That's just like not as much of an issue in Japan because Japan has quite frankly like always pretty much been anti-immigration.
Mhm.
Like it's a very shut-in nation. Obviously, historically, literally closed borders. But even now, like it's not very friendly to immigration, I would say.
Yeah. Makes sense. Well, Riki, as always, this has been a great conversation. To our fans, we want to know what you have to think. We want to know, Riki, as
We
always,
we do want to know what you have to think.
yeah, yeah. Riki, as always, this has been a great conversation. Our fans, we want to know what you have to say, what you have to think. Let us know. Find all the things in the show notes. On behalf of myself and Riki, we have spoken.
Bum 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 bum.
That Godzilla yell, Mary was saying, like we were about 2/3 of the way through the movie, and she was like, "Are we not going to get the yell? Are we not going to get the yell?" And then we did get the Godzilla
Oh
yell.
yeah, you have to have that. You have to have the musical the theme that I just
Uh huh.
badly sung. Because that's the when the monster appears theme
Yeah,
song.
I love it. All right. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye bye.